A trend I have seen on the internet and around the TTRPG space, online and offline, is this question. Is there a Dungeon Master crisis happening right now? And I believe there is. So yes. Why? Well, because DMing in D&D 5e is very difficult, especially for newbies. But that doesn't help you at all. I'm sure you might want more context. Where did this conversation start? Why is it happening? And better yet, what are some things as individuals we can do to help support our game masters / DMs and RPG hobbyists overall? First, let's discuss where did this conversation start. So, this conversation started out from a Hell's Gate New York City article that talked about the fact that there is a huge Dungeon Master crisis happening in New York City. Because of Dungeons & Dragons' popularity over the years, due to the pandemic, and due to its cultural presence in media, there has been a huge uprising, quote-unquote, for players, aka there are a lot more players than there are DMs willing to run Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons sales jumped by 33% in 2022 due to the pandemic and everyone moving their games virtually. And Dungeons & Dragons growth is apparent as we can see here. From a new D&D movie being released on March 3rd, as well as there being an off-Broadway Dungeons & Dragons inspired musical this past June of 2022. Furthermore, the amount of D&D references in media is nothing to look past. The most famous example is Stranger Things. And if we want to talk about video games, any JRPG from the early 80s has some influence from D&D. Think of Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. So this growth in popularity was bound to happen when you have a huge pandemic and people seeing one of the most popular TTRPGs in media. And the best thing is that the article makes this final and strong point, that one of the ways that players and GMs have been resolving this is through, well, paid games or games with their friends with some kind of payment up front. And those are awesome options, and I think paid GMs and paid DMs should get paid for their work. But the article didn't address an underlying issue that I think needs to be present. It's that because of this huge growth in popularity and cultural presence, there are a lot more players. But unfortunately, that player presence, while it does exist, that is not the case for DMing. DMing in Dungeons & Dragons is a beast in its own right, and between the financial constraints, the time constraints, and, well, the expectations that have been set because of D&D's popularity in, say, games like Critical Role or Dimension 20 or even movies and books, DMing can and might bring burnout to you. So it's not a shocker that there's a TM crisis. And yes, there is an argument to be made about the fact that the article was made for New York City, and you are very right about that. But I think there are a couple topics that other YouTubers and myself have brought up that are pretty concerning. In fact, Questing Beasts is the person that inspired me to make this, amongst others, and they're in the old school Renaissance section of RPG hobbyists. With all of their years of experience, they know that D&D can be taxing due to the lengthiness of the rules, and that many players want story-based games. And they're absolutely right. But there were a couple things I was thinking about that weren't addressed that I think also make DMing for D&D 5e difficult. In this case, I've categorized these issues into 4 reasons. So starting off reason number 1. Many of the books and content released for D&D 5e are marketed towards players rather than game masters. Books like Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, Spelljammer, Mordenkainen, and other books introduce a lot of races, spells, subclasses, background, feats, and other miscellaneous and awesome information that is useful for the player. And let me be clear, I love those books. I love D&D 5e, and I like playing cool races, cool subclasses, and interesting and inventive features. However, it would be pretty vital for a GM to have resources as well. For example, what tools exist officially to create traps and puzzles in D&D 5e? There are some things to work off of, like the random trap generator in the DMG on page 297. Aside from that, and maybe something here or there in the Game Master's Guide, there isn't much there. Also, since many of these books are marketed towards players, there are new rules, errata, and changing player meta that are things DMs need to be aware of or have to manage in their games. And that's already expecting a lot from dungeon masters who don't have the resources necessary to, well, resolve all the issues that they might face. Number 2. Every player wants to play story-based games, but unfortunately story-based RPGs require more prep, because the Dungeon Master has to wove in the plot for that character's backstory. And let me be clear, I love story-based games. However, those do require more prep. As a Game Master and a Dungeon Master, I know it takes time. This means if you are doing a story-based game, this means that the plot related for them has to include encounters that relate to the character's backstory. So, monsters, NPCs, puzzles have to relate to your player characters, and that takes thought, time, consideration, and planning. Whereas location-based games don't require nearly as much prep. If you provide the players with a location and problems in this location, then the encounter won't require all the back thought and backstory thought and interconnections and everything like that. Number 3. D&D 5e has been popularized for the past couple of years, and because of this player boom, many people, I think, have an assumption that this is a passive form of entertainment. I think when you see D&D in actual plays, live shows, movie, or television, you get this primrose perception of the game, that everything is perfect, that all of the players work together, and that there's no conflict between any of the players or the game master. However, that's not the case. That assumption, I think, makes it so that players just assume they can show up and boom, entertainment follows. That mentality can be harmful, and as someone who's GM'd and DM'd with players like that, it can be really exhausting having to present information and topics and thoughts to players who just assume that they're watching TV. There's no active engagement. Furthermore, the pressure is put entirely on the Dungeon Master to provide fun to the players, rather than assuming that it's both the players and the Dungeon Master's responsibility to have fun together. Of course, these issues can be solved over session 0 as well as during the application process to your game, but I have noticed there's been a spark in that issue of players feeling quote-unquote entitled, and I don't want to sound like that kind of boomer, but I have seen it a couple times and I don't think I'm the only one. Everyone who's not an RPG hobbyist knows of D&D and its major influence. So, Dungeon Masters get put up on pedestals and are held to a higher extent, and it's unfair to the DM when not all DMs can provide the exact same service or opportunities than, say, a full-on production team, a movie, or your favorite RPG hobbyist online. And this combo of lackluster GM support, story-based games, popularization, and the advent of actual plays like Dimension 20 and Critical Role, I think are negatively affecting DMs and causing them to, well, burn out. And I know that there are some, well, maybe systematic things we can do over time. There are also some individual things that I know we can start doing within our own tables, groups, or friends and family. I think that starts off with players needing to hold themselves responsible at the table. So what do I mean by players need to hold themselves responsible at the table? Well, running a game, whether it is D&D or whatever have you, is a collaborative effort. Everyone needs to pitch in to make the game fun. One issue is assuming that the Dungeon Master or the Game Master is the only person that's there to entertain you. No, it's up to both you, player or Game Master, and you, other players or Game Master, to make this game fun together. This is a collaborative storytelling experience. It means players and GMs trust each other and actively are working to create fun at the table. For instance, the Game Master is providing a challenging and thoughtful encounter in their tabletop RPG, while the players are showing up ready and giving 100% effort. And while I'm sure that's the ideal for many, I know that everyone feels that way. But that doesn't mean you need to show up 100%. But it does mean that you need to at least try, and that you should be engaging with the GM, and if the GM is asking for help, you provide some help. Obviously to the best of your ability. I think another key facet to make any RPG experience better, whether it's D&D or anything else, is to resolve scheduling issues early on and set boundaries early on. These are social games, so people's personalities, politics, ideas, and other traits, features, and identities are going to be apparent in an online and offline game. So it's important that we set the boundary on what you should be able to talk about, what you don't want to hear at the table, as well as other things that might be important. For example, maybe your game master wants you to bring food if you're running an in-person game, especially if they're prepping hours and hours worth of game material for you. Or, for players, maybe it might help to, well, shower or to take care of yourself before you head over to your game master's place. It's these simple things that might make a big difference in your game quality. Simply taking care of yourself, resolving scheduling issues early on and not leaving those to the last minute can make or break an RPG, especially when the dungeon master is running multiple games or running hour-long story-based games. And I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this, but seriously, just play something different. I know this is an annoying answer, but D&D cannot and should not be your everything game. There is only so much you can homebrew or hack into D&D 5e, and D&D has a lot of really great things to it. Its online support and great fan base allow you to create any kind of character within the confines of an epic fantasy game. Also, playing D&D and running D&D can be expensive. The core rulebooks alone, the monster manual, the player's handbook, and the game master's guide can come up to $150, but if you're buying that from, say, a bookstore or, say, a game store, then that can go even higher, $200 to $250, not including supplements, fees, and also tools necessary to play the game. And if we're talking about online virtual tabletops, then it gets even more expensive, whereas other systems can be run just with that book. Think of Shadowrun. In Shadowrun, when you buy the game, it includes a PDF when you buy the physical book. Or in Mask New Generation, it includes everything you need to run the game as well as play the game. And there are even Powered by the Apocalypse games that have community copies that I've covered in other videos, or games that are entirely free, like World of Dungeons, which is entirely free and is based off of, well, old editions of D&D, aka OSR. So, not only is the upfront cost of playing D&D way more expensive, but running it is also much more hassle because of the lack of DM support. So I really recommend that you try other RPGs. And unfortunately, Wizards of the Coast is making way too much money from D&D 5e and, well, soon to be 1D&D to change their publication trajectory. I think it's also because they're a company that wants to make money, and they know that much of the money is in, well, the publicity and movies and creating more and more and more player content. So one thing I learned is, well, to not worry about, well, what a major company wants to do, because there's only so much we can do as individuals. It's going to take a community effort to, well, change the trajectory of D&D 5e. In fact, I think Questing Beast in one of their latest videos as of, well, this recording makes a good point about why you really shouldn't focus on Wizards of the Coast, or specifically on, well, their decision-making process of business. They quote, "It's probably not healthy to get too wrapped up with what an impersonal, for-profit corporation does. They're never going to make the best creative decisions, and you don't really have any say over what they do. It's best not to tie up your identity to a one-sided relationship like that. And seriously, you really shouldn't, because, well, Wizards of the Coast is going to keep making money no matter what we say or do. The question is, what are you going to do? Are you going to switch over to a new TTRPG? Maybe a rules-light TTRPG? Or maybe a different genre entirely? Let me know down below in the description box on what are your thoughts on D&D 5e's possible DM crisis. And as always, I'm your average everyday queer host, Blurry Disposition, and hope you all have an awesome day. Ciao!